Hi, I'm Jeff Ginter with Real Progressives. Thanks for joining us here every Monday night on MMT Mondays. What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to get the experts and everything they have to say out there for the general population. These are not new interviews. Some of them are a little bit older, some of them are newer, but all of them are incredibly important for the general population to start understanding modern monetary theory, how the economy actually works. So for those of you who are new to MMT, these can be wonderful, groundbreaking aha moments. Some of them may be a little bit deeper than you would like to go, but hopefully they're having you ask important questions. So tonight we are going to present for you Fadhel Kaboub, and he's going to be talking about the Green New Deal. What is it? And the absolute importance of the integration of the federal jobs guarantee to the success of the Green New Deal and the success of the stabilization of our economy. By the end of this video, hopefully a lot of your questions will be answered, but if not, ask them. That's what this is all about, so that when the time comes and you're confronted with a politician who is saying we can't afford the Green New Deal, it's too expensive, a federal job guarantee is socialism, sorry, I understand what these things are, and you either don't understand and I'm going to educate you, or you do understand and you would rather I don't. If you don't understand how the economy works, get out of the way and let someone who does take over. And if you do understand how the economy works and you don't want us to have these programs, then let's have that conversation. But I promise you, by the end of it, you're going to lose. Because for 40 years, the only argument against these programs has been the federal government can't afford it. And it always could, and it still can, because it's about resource allocation, not about the availability of money. It's not about taxpayer money. It's about resource allocation. Do we have the stuff? Thanks for joining us. Please enjoy Fadhel Kaboub.
Thank you all for being here. This is an honor to join you all for this discussion. Thank you. Today I want to talk about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is not a bill, it's not a law, it's not in place, it's just a resolution, which is an invitation for all of us to think deeply about the main challenges that face us in this country and face the world, to be honest. But we'll talk about things from a US perspective today. So here we go. Here's my main message. Here's what we have. We have a climate emergency, millions of people who want to work but can't find jobs across the world, and across this country, including in this community. There's lots of hidden unemployment despite the numbers you've seen this morning. There's green tech innovations, technology that is getting more efficient, cheaper every day. So the resources are there, the technology is there, the people who want to work are there, and it's just a question of matching these resources to make it happen. And the big question is always, where does the money come from? Can we afford it, right? And what I want to argue is what we can't afford is the existing system, and that the money's there. And I'd like to introduce you to a framework today. Some of you have heard me say this before, but a framework that demonstrates that the federal government, not the local state and municipalities, not the local budget, the federal government can afford it. We have the resources, we've done it before, and this is how we always spend without bankrupting the country, without causing inflation, without turning the country into a Venezuela, like what most people say in the media these days. So here we go. Climate emergency. This should move in 1 second. Yep. So this is what the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution has done to the planet. We're spiraling out of control. Most climate scientists will tell us that 2 degrees Celsius is the limit beyond which it's going to be really a point of no return. And we're spiraling out of control in the last couple of decades, and there's nothing substantial to turn this around and bring this under control. So we need a massive intervention, urgent intervention. This is where we are as of 2017. This is, going back thousands of years, this is clearly us, the Industrial Revolution, that did this. This is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. It's spiraling out of control since the Industrial Revolution. So this is not your usual cycles of the planet. CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, most scientists have been warning us that 350 ppm, parts per million, should be the limit, and beyond which things will spiral out of control. This is as of a year ago. We're above the 400 limit already. There's an organization called 350.org. The 350 is about the 350 parts per million. So this should have been done, in the 70s when we read Silent Spring. That's when the emergency, alarm bells should have been going off and intervention should have been massive. But we've waited for too long. The IPCC report recently told us that we have 12 years. The clock is ticking. 12 years to bring about massive action, not 12 years to think and debate. So that's where we are in terms of emergency. And this is a global issue. This is a picture of the Middle East during the summer time. Most scientists now are certain that within our lifetime, within the next 4 or 5 decades, this region of the world will be uninhabitable during the summer months, which means climate refugees. Climate refugees, not in 50 years, climate refugees are moving as we speak and have been moving quietly as we speak. It's just frequently they're identified as refugees from war zones. Most people don't realize that the Syrian refugee crisis didn't actually start with the Arab Spring or with the conflict and military confrontation and terrorism and all of that. It started at least 3 years before any political conflict emerged. It started 3 years because Syria experienced its most severe drought in 2005, 2006, that destroyed 85% of the livestock in the country, dislocated 1.5 million people internally, moved from rural areas to the big cities because their livelihood was destroyed. Syria was a self-sufficient country in food production, and it became a net importer of food in 2008 during the financial crisis when food prices were skyrocketing across the world. So the worst time to start importing food is when food prices globally are increasing. And food prices globally were increasing because of droughts and fires in Australia and Russia and other parts of the world. Major wheat producers also lost production. So the refugees started moving then, not after the conflict. So I'm not saying that climate change is what causes wars, but it's one of those factors that exacerbate the problems. So this is serious. This is already happening. It's in motion. How do people feel about this in the US? The good news is that most Americans think that protecting the environment will create jobs. We can create jobs to address poverty, unemployment, and socioeconomic exclusion while at the same time addressing climate change. So this is not one or the other. The good news is that we can do both at the same time, and one feeds into the other. And this is increasingly the case in terms of public opinion in the US. This is from Data for Progress. This is as of, I forget the year, not more than 2016 survey. Jobs policies are the most popular program in American public opinion. This is a survey asking Democrats and Republicans about what are the most popular jobs programs. A job guarantee, which is one of the core components of the Green New Deal, is the most popular policy for Democrats and for Republicans, hands down. So this is not controversial in the sense that the mainstream media makes us think sometimes. This is same source, Data for Progress, support for a job guarantee. It's across the country. It's not one particular coast or one particular region of the country that says job guarantee is a good idea, fighting climate change is a good idea. This is mainstream as far as the public is concerned. And I'll show you some specific data for Ohio. And this is, again, as of 2017, I think, if I remember correctly. This is from Data for Progress. So polling in Ohio, would you support or oppose, given every American who vote for candidates who want a 100% transition to renewable energy? Same thing, 49% of people say they're more likely to vote for those candidates who want 100% green electricity. 18% say no, and 33% are not sure. And again, it's because people are not sure where the money is going to come from, how is this going to affect me, my community. Even if it's not taxing the individual, they say, if you're going to tax companies, I work for those companies. So you're going to raise their cost of doing business, they're going to go out of business, then I'm out of a job. So there's always the concern about where does the money come from. It's not necessarily directly taxing the working class. It's taxing somebody else who's going to take it out on me, so to speak. So green job candidates, same thing. This is also Ohio data, and it's very consistent with national data for all kinds of other states. So if you're interested in this, Data for Progress has all of these surveys about green jobs and Green New Deal and job guarantee. So what is the Green New Deal? Number one, it's very important to recognize that this is federally funded, just like the original New Deal. It was not funded by local states and municipalities. This is the federal government. This is Congress using the power of the purse to make this happen. And we've done it before, by the way. The Green New Deal is based, philosophically on the original New Deal, which happened in the midst of the Great Depression, the most miserable time in American history, where the country was broke. People were broke. Millions of people were not working. People were starving. And somehow we figured out a way to make it happen, to build massive resources, infrastructure, not just construction, but education and after-school programs and literacy programs and theater and music and all kinds of aspects of the economy and culture were involved in the original New Deal. And we're borrowing some of these concepts for the Green New Deal. It's locally implemented, so it's decentralized. So local organizations, local community groups will decide these are the priorities that we want to achieve in this community. We'll apply for a grant from the federal government to fund those programs. So the funding comes from the national authority. The selection of the projects, the implementation, the hiring, the management, the auditing, everything is done locally. And this is what democracy was supposed to be. It's participatory democracy, so that you empower people at the local level to take things into their own hands. And to be honest, somebody at the federal government will not know what is actually needed in a particular community. They'll decide everybody needs highways. Well, but maybe a highway is not the priority of this particular community. Maybe there's other priorities. And this is where it's extremely important to do this in a participatory way, with the management and the selection of the projects to be done at the local level. The original New Deal was implemented in every district in the country. So nobody was left behind, so to speak, at least in terms of geography. But it was not inclusive. The original New Deal was excluded African Americans, and it was part of the divide that existed during that time was also enforced with the New Deal. So the Green New Deal will have to be inclusive and fully participatory to lift up all communities. It has to be urban and rural. This is not just big projects for the big cities. It has to be inclusive, as I said, in terms of not repeating the mistakes of the original New Deal. It has to be just, as in just transition. So yes, we want to decarbonize the economy, which means we want to leave coal on the ground and move away from fossil fuels. But this is not to say to destroy the livelihood of people who work in fossil fuel industry. So a just transition, meaning a job guarantee with decent wages and benefits for people to transition from the industries that we want to eliminate to the new industries that we want to create and thrive for the future. And this is unfortunately not well understood in the public discourse so far, because it's viewed as the Green New Deal wants to destroy, small towns that rely on coal mines and small towns that rely on fracking, because so far it's the only industry and it's the only source of jobs and revenues and prosperity for a community. So you take that away without putting anything in, you've just destroyed the town. So of course people are going to oppose it. That's their livelihood. But you have to bring in a guaranteed alternative that gives decent wages and benefits and redevelop the local economy, not in a haphazard way, but in a well-designed way that fits into the new vision that we have for the country. And that's why it's a New Deal. It's not just a haphazard transition, right? And it has to be restorative. It has to restore communities and repair the damage that's been done over the last several decades. Because when you have small towns, especially in the Rust Belt area, that rely exclusively on one industry, and that industry relocates to another country or goes out of business, then there's nothing that comes in place. There's no transition mechanism. And that's been going on since the 1970s and 80s in this country. And that's partly what explains this severe political divide that we've experienced in 2016 during the election cycle. When Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump said, trade is the issue, outsourcing is the issue, they pinched a nerve in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt. And people said, yes, finally somebody running for office recognizing our pain and recognizing why small towns in the Rust Belt have been left behind, because Democrats and Republicans since the 1970s have been all about free trade, and free trade is good for America. Yes, free trade is good overall, but when it comes to the small towns that lost those industries, we didn't plan anything to upgrade and transform since the 1970s, so those people were left behind. And when Bernie Sanders said, I feel your pain, when Donald Trump said, I feel your pain, it set the whole thing in motion. And those who felt, more leaning to the right went with Trump, those leaning more to the left went with Bernie Sanders. And that pain is still here. This 2019, this 2020 election is still there. So the issues are still here, and this is why the Green New Deal must restore the damage, repair the damage that's been done in those communities by providing a true alternative for reorganizing the local economy. It has to be comprehensive and permanent. We can't just say it's going to be just solar and wind and then things will trickle down and everybody else will be fine. It has to be comprehensive in the sense that we have to start with the list that every community says, these are our priorities, these are the things that we want to achieve, and these are the people in the community with the existing level of skills. If we have a list of priorities and have a list of existing skills in the community, and if magically the skills match the needs, then so be it. We'll make it happen. But in most of the time, the skills will not match the needs. And this is where there's an opportunity for on-the-job paid training to transition into full-time work, to transition into the community that we want to create that has all the assets and all the resources and all the skills to thrive. And this is why we talk about the job guarantee. The job guarantee is not meant to be a temporary thing to train people in some skills that will become obsolete in 5 or 10 years, and then let people, fall through the cracks again. Because the one thing that's constant in this economy, in any economy, is technological innovation and automation especially, which means over time there'll be less need for simple repetitive tasks, manufacturing tasks. If anything, we shouldn't resist the robots and kind of become Luddites. If anything, we should embrace automation, but with a plan. Embrace automation in the sense that we should let the robots do all the precarious work, all the dangerous work, all the work that no human being should do. And at the same time, guarantee that we create jobs where individuals can thrive and prosper with decent wages. And that area is the care economy. Caring for people, caring for the elderly, caring for children, caring for the planet, caring for each other. That's where the value added is. And that means building a transition economy that focuses on those skills and builds communities from within. The robots are not coming anytime soon, by the way. It's a slow, gradual process. It's been happening since the Industrial Revolution. It's not new. It's just accelerating a little bit now in new areas. But it's not something that's going to happen the next morning. We're not even close to that science fiction scenario of robots doing everything. So this has to be permanent because the change is permanent. And the skills are always changing. The required skills are changing. So we can't do this haphazard and wait for the crisis to happen and then say, what do we do now? Do we retrain? We have to have this permanent on-the-job training all the time so that we're constantly transitioning to higher and higher levels of participation. So how do we pay for it? This is the big question. How do we guarantee decent wages and benefits for everyone? We're told that the government is broke, we're running out of dollars, we have to borrow more money from China. This is going to cause inflation, hyperinflation, the whole thing. There's a long list of things that you hear in the media all the time. All of these arguments are based on a very simple but dangerous misunderstanding of public finance. And I'd like you to stay with me for 1 second for this one simple distinction that will completely set the conversation under a new tone if we recognize this condition, this distinction. Most people, when they think about government finances, they think of it from an individual perspective. They say, just like I work hard and earn an income every month, and then that's what I use to spend. Right? I live within my means. I balance my checkbook. And if I need to spend beyond my income, I can borrow from a bank up to a certain point. You can't have unlimited borrowing. And once you have that debt, that becomes a real financial burden on your family, on your finances. And then you have to work even harder to pay it off. Or, tighten your belts financially a little bit so that you spend less in the next few months so you can pay off the bills. That's absolutely true for individuals. It's also true for businesses. You can't borrow unlimited amounts from banks. You have to earn it. Same is true for cities and municipalities and state governments. The state of Ohio, it spends its tax revenues, and it can borrow up to a certain point. And beyond that, we have to pay for it. How do we pay for it? With more tax revenues at the state level. That is true for states, individuals, anybody in the private sector. The federal government is not in the same situation. The federal government is the sovereign issuer of the currency. It spends money into existence. So it doesn't need tax revenues in order to fund things. And this is where the sequence of events is extremely important. Getting the logic for us versus the federal government will completely liberate us into this exercise. The federal government, in order for us, you and I, to have dollars to use and spend and borrow to each other, and lend and borrow from each other, and pay taxes to the government, those dollars must have been spent into existence in the first place. The only entity that can do that is the federal government. Nobody can issue US dollars. You go to jail for a long time if you do that. It's counterfeit. So the federal government has to inject money into circulation first, and then it taxes some of it back. If it taxes all of it back to balance the budget, there'll be nothing left in the private sector, right? Now, banks also create money. They don't print money. They create money by issuing credit. But that credit is denominated in US dollars and is regulated by the US government, and banks have a special license to do that. It's a banking license. So it's not like they can print their own money, but they do have the authority to issue credit to help expand the economy. But it's limited and it's regulated based on what it takes to keep the bank running, right? So ultimately, it's the federal government that issues money into existence, which means my debt to the bank is not the same thing as the government's national debt, the federal government's national debt. The state of Ohio's debt, corporate debt, those are real financial burdens that need to be paid. The federal government's so-called national debt is not the same thing as a personal debt. And that's why it's rising. It keeps rising over time, because every deficit that the government at the federal level spends, that's money injected into circulation that hasn't been taxed yet. So that's the rest of us who have access to those resources. Not equally, obviously there's inequality. Some of it goes abroad. A lot of it is here in this country and is distributed mostly to the top, right? So there's a question of distribution there, which we can talk about in a democracy, right? But the key of the logic here is that the government can afford to spend on anything it wants. The federal government, anything that is for sale in US dollars domestically, the government can do it, and we have mechanisms to make sure that there's no inflation, that the country doesn't go bankrupt. And I can talk about those mechanisms. How about inflation? What if the government just starts spending unlimited amounts of money to hire people and build resources and start wars and whatever it is that the priorities are. And Medicare for all, does that mean that I'm saying that unlimited spending is okay? I definitely did not say that, and I'll never say that. The spending is not going to be inflationary as long as we have the physical resources, the unemployed labor, the know-how, the technologies to make those things happen. So if the government decides today, we believe that having access to dental care is a human right, and the federal government says we're going to pay for it. Anybody, pick up the phone, call your dentist, schedule an appointment, the government pays for it, because that today became the national priority. So I pick up the phone, call the dentist, say I'd like to schedule an appointment. They say, oh, we're happy to take you, the government is paying for it. The next opening is in 7 years. But we do have a premium golden membership. If you pay $10,000 a month, we can get you in next Wednesday. So that feeds into inequality, that feeds into inflation, because we have shortage of actual resources of productive capacity of dentists and raw materials and dental hygienists. But the good news is that those resources are producible. We can train more, we can invest more in those resources. But we can't say the government can just afford everything without thinking about the real productive resources. So as long as we have unused resources in certain areas of the economy, including labor, and including raw materials and technology and know-how, then the spending will not be inflationary. You pick up the phone, you schedule, they say, yeah, we have an appointment next Wednesday. Right? We have plenty of productive capacity to meet the demand of the nation. So this is where the spending needs to go. It needs to go in areas that have excess productive capacity that we can use, and it needs to go in areas where currently there's inflationary pressure as we speak before the Green New Deal, and we want to target those areas and increase productive capacity and increase efficiency. So you're employing people to address the root causes of the problem. So the spending in and of itself is not inflationary, it's not automatically inflationary, only in relation to the productive capacity of the nation. And that's why you find countries around the world that experience hyperinflation, they tend to be countries with very weak productive capacity or go through a major period of destruction of productive capacity, like Zimbabwe, for example. So there are cases where you can explain why hyperinflation happened, but it's not always more government spending, more deficits, more national debt automatically leads to hyperinflation. I'll give you one example to seal this deal, and then we'll move to the next slide. Japan. Japan has the largest national debt in the world, in the developed world, 250% of GDP. When it was 80%, 90%, people said Japan is going to go broke, the whole system is going to collapse, and then it went above 100, and then 150, and then 200, and now it's 250. Japan doesn't even have inflation. Japan has been living in a deflationary period for 3 decades. Why? Because it has massive productive capacity, and it's an export-oriented country, and all the deficit and the national debt is denominated in its own national currency. Japan doesn't have any external debt. Every single Japanese bond that they issue, that's the debt, right, is denominated in Japanese yen, which means they promise to pay back in Japanese yen, which they can issue into existence. The same thing for the US. The entire national debt is denominated in US dollars, which the federal government issues into existence. So there's no risk of default. There's no risk of bankruptcy. It's like saying, I can issue my own currency and everybody uses it in this town. I can't run out of my own money. It's just not a possibility. The possibility is if we run out of real physical resources to build things, then we're in trouble. Then we have a real shortage. But it's not the money, it's the real resources. So if we have this vision now, we can take millions of people who want to work, and we can take the climate challenge, the inequality challenge, and start building resources and start fixing this. And the federal government can afford it. Not the state, not the local municipality, not your individual, middle class, working class taxes. Right? This is very important. I think I probably covered a few slides just by doing this. How did we finance World War II? World War II came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history, right? There's no money to be borrowed. There's no money to be taxed to start this massive war effort in 1942. Where did the money come from? War bonds. Somebody said war bonds. War bonds were not sold before the war. They were sold during the war. So let's follow the logic here. The war starts and massive amount of production takes place. People are hired, they pay decent wages. We're working double and triple shifts. We bring women into the labor force, older people in the labor force, just to keep up with the war production effort. So lots of money is paid with the power of the purse from Congress. Money spent into existence, not taxed before the war. There was no meeting in Congress that says, where's the money going to come from? Who are we going to tax? Are we going to borrow from China? Can we afford this? There was no question. This is a national security priority, a global security priority. We're going to do it and we're going to win this. So the money was spent into existence. Step two, all those workers now have cash. They're going to go out and buy a new car, a new house, buy whatever they want. It's a free country, right? That's where the war bonds came in. They were called freedom bonds. They were promoted as, leveraging the patriotic mood of the nation, saying, postpone your consumption. Don't buy a new car. Don't buy a new house. Wait until after the war. Buy these government bonds, pieces of paper that we call freedom bonds or war bonds. Buy them, which means the government takes your cash. You postpone your consumption for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And now that cash is out of circulation. So there's no money out there to bid up prices for cars and homes and consumer goods. So we had a mechanism in place to deal with inflation in the case of that emergency. But the logic is very important. The spending happened first. The taxing and the quote-unquote borrowing happened during the war, not before the war. So the sequencing is important. Whereas most of us think the government needs to borrow first in order to spend, just like you and I. Or the government needs to earn the money first in order to spend, just like you and I. Not the federal government, not the issuer of the currency. So we've done this before, and this is not a unique scenario. Every federal government spending happens in this way. We just don't notice it, because we see the spending and taxing and borrowing happening at the same time, and we don't think of the logic of it. We always think of it from an individual perspective. My logic applies for the government too, when it's not. Which means the same way we addressed World War II as a national emergency, as a global emergency, today we have a climate emergency, we have an unemployment emergency, we have inequality emergency. So now this raises the question, what's the purpose of taxing? Why does the government tax us, the working class, the middle class, and tells us that you need to pay for Social Security, you need to pay for this, that, and the other, right? So this brings the question of distribution. If the government doesn't need taxes in advance in order to spend, and the spending happens by spending into existence, then that means the tax revenues don't fund spending. So that means taxing pollution doesn't really fund the Green New Deal. Taxing pollution should be done because we want to tax pollution, because we want to minimize pollution. So it changes the role of taxation from a source of funding to a series of other purposes. One of which is dealing with inflation, as I explained in a minute. The other one is to reduce pollution, to capitalize on the incentive of saying we want to transition away from this. Taxing speculation in financial markets, not because we want Wall Street money to pay for education, but because speculation is bad. We want to minimize speculation to create more financial stability. Taxing the ultra-rich is not because we need their money to pay for healthcare. Taxing the rich is to reduce inequality, to reduce their power and influence in the democratic process and in the economic process. Part of it is also dealing with inflation because of the market power that they exercise politically and economically. So we're not saying don't tax the rich, don't tax pollution, don't tax this and that, but let's be clear about the purpose of taxation. The purpose of taxation is to minimize the negative effects that we see in society, whether it's inequality or power and influence or oligarchy or pollution or speculation or gambling or whatever it is we want to minimize as a society, as a democratic society. So then we shouldn't associate these two things as one piece and say, if we can't tax Wall Street, if we can't tax the rich, if we can't tax pollution, then we can't have a Green New Deal. Then we're stuck. Can you imagine if this was the conversation before World War II? If we can't tax the rich, if we can't tax this, if we can't tax that, then we're going to speak German in 10 years. That was not the conversation. So this is really the key distinction to understand that paying for the Green New Deal is not burdensome in the same way you think about it from a personal finance perspective. I keep clicking the other remote. All right. So I'm going to skip a few things here and just highlight the extent of the problems that we deal with nationally, and then zoom in a little bit on Licking County. So this picture, bear with me here. This shows after every major recession that we dealt with in the country since the Great Depression, the gains from the recession, the gains from the recovery, who gains the most, the rich or the poor? And this is divided not rich and poor, but the bottom 90% of the population and the top 10%, the wealthiest 10%. And it used to be the case, should have a laser thingy here, do I? It used to be the case, where's my laser? It used to be the case that the blue bars, the 90% of the population, gets most of the gains from the recovery after every recession. And then starting the 80s and beyond, we start seeing most of the gains from the recovery go to the richest 10% of the population. This is a big problem. This system is messed up. This is not how it's supposed to work in a democracy, where the top 10% gets all the gains from the recovery. So after every recession, the bottom 90% of the population essentially gets nothing. And look at what happened in the last one. The top 10% got beyond the 100% of the recovery, and the bottom 90% lost. So this is why we call it the Great Recession. Because even though the recession ended, and there was a recovery, and there was money made out of the recovery, the distribution of that recovery didn't go to the middle class, to the working class. And the quality of jobs that were created were of lower quality, more precarious, more part-time work. So this is why people feel like the recession lasted for 10 years, when it technically lasted for a very short amount of time. Right? So this is why inequality is absolutely important to address as part of the Green New Deal package. And what I said about taxation is extremely important for that purpose, not because we need the money to pay for solar farms or decent wages. The metric that we use to measure the economy and the growth of the economy is misleading. And this is why we are facing this climate crisis. Most economists tell you the way we measure economic growth is GDP, gross domestic product, which is the total dollar amount of all goods and services produced every year. So the more we produce, the more the economy grows and GDP grows. And it used to be that the more economic activity we have, the more jobs we have. So there's sort of shared prosperity in that process. But with increasing automation and increased outsourcing, we can produce way more with fewer people. And money flows to the top. Not to mention the pollution, because the more forests we destroy, the more things we build. Every time you get a breathing condition, an asthma condition, you go to the hospital, you pay a bill, you pay for a prescription, breathing treatment. All of that shows up as positive numbers in GDP, because the economy is thriving. There's more sales, there's more revenue for pharmaceuticals. But is that good quality of life that we can't breathe? Every time families spend thousands of dollars in cancer treatment, GDP goes up. The more cancer we have, the more GDP increases. We call that on TV economic growth, and it gets celebrated as economic growth. The more the water is polluted, people get sick, same thing. You pay the bills, GDP goes up, right? If your roof is leaking, if the home is not weatherized, all of this stuff is more spending, right? So that's the wrong metric. So some economists, ecological economists, rearranged the way we look at this thing and came up with something called GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, which takes the GDP numbers and eliminates all the negative effects out of it, because that's inflating it. And then it adds the things that matter, including volunteer work, the value of care that goes undervalued in the real economy today, but it's a real asset to society. It takes into account the effects of inequality. It takes into account the things that matter for quality of life. And when you do that, for most industrialized economies, including the US, look at GDP versus GPI. We've been stagnating in terms of quality of life for decades. But the economy is doing well, and it gets celebrated. So the first thing to do is to refocus our attention on the things that matter and measure the value of the things that matter, not measure the value of more cancer treatment being a good thing for society. It's a good thing for the economy from that numerical measure, but that's not good quality of life. So then when they say cleaning the water supply and cleaning the environment and cleaning this, that, and the other is too expensive, we can't afford it, they're thinking about how much does it cost to put the smokestack filters and filters for the water treatment system. Yeah, that's expensive stuff. But compare that with the amount of money you spend on cancer treatment for the next 30 years. They don't measure that when they make that decision. And once you start doing that, you realize that what we're doing currently is too expensive, is unaffordable. That it's actually cheaper to have after-school programs for kids than to build prisons for those same kids over the next 30 years. Dollar per dollar, it's cheaper. Yet we don't think about it in that way. We think, well, it's just cheaper to balance the budget and cut the after-school program and everything will be fine. Well, it's not fine. We live the consequences of this. So if anything, what I'm proposing here, forget about what I said about World War II and the money and the logic and all that. It's cheaper either way, even if you have to pay for it with taxes or whatever, right? So rampant inequality is, you've seen these numbers probably in the media. 2015, 80 people owned as much as half of humanity. 2016, only 61 people, not 61,000, 61 people. 2017, 42 people. 2018, 26 people. 2019, maybe 3. I don't know. It's not moving in the right direction. So this has to be corrected. This has to be adjusted. This system can't keep going in this direction in terms of inequality, in terms of socioeconomic exclusion, and in terms of the climate crisis. We're not even putting a dent in this thing. And we're still talking about what to do, right? When the reality says we need to go in World War II type of investment, where there was no question. When the war started, FDR asked, what does it take to win this thing? And he was told, we need 180,000 airplanes produced in the first year just to get started. And he said, okay, how much can we produce? They said, we can't do more than 30,000. Guess how much was produced the first year? 300,000. Right? Resources are producible. If you set the priorities straight and put the resources on the table and make it happen, it will happen. How did JFK put a man on the moon? Everybody said, there's no way. It can't be done in 10 years. We just don't have the science. We don't have the technology. And it became a national priority. And it happened. And all this technology you see around you here, this came out of the space program. Right? So it's beyond our imagination. So let's do the same thing with climate change. Let's address inequality and let's fix this thing and set the priorities straight and give millions of people jobs that pay decent wages and transform every local economy into a sustainable, thriving, prosperous economy. This is where we are in Licking County. And I'm sorry this is small, but I can send you the PowerPoint and I can read some of the numbers for you. So this is the minimum wage versus the living wage. You know what the minimum wage is. I'm not going to repeat that. The living wage, what does it actually take for a family of 2 children and 2 parents, 1 working and 1 not working? The living wage should be $23 an hour, right? Who makes $23 an hour on a minimum wage? It doesn't add up. So what happens to people when they don't have a living wage to pay for rent, to pay for transportation, to pay for basic necessities? This data, by the way, is from MIT, the geography department. They have a national database for all living wages for every county in the country. And then if you click on the details, it shows you the cost of living in every county for a family of 2, a family of 3, with kids, without kids, and so on. So it's all mapped there for us to figure out what does it actually take for a family of 2 or a family of 3 to have a basic, decent, dignified quality of life. And you look at the big expense items, childcare for families who work. And that's why people end up having 1 parent not working, because it's unaffordable. Right? So childcare is an extremely important thing. Transportation, housing, all of these, we know what the issues are. We have the numbers. But do we have the political will to transform an economy so that people who work full-time can actually have a decent quality of life? This is a big problem. And it's not going away by waiting for something to magically happen. We have to identify the issues and go after them. This is the State of Ohio kind of report card from One Ohio Now, which is one of our local think tanks in Columbus. And the report card is not pretty in terms of poverty, in terms of high school graduation rates, and this gives you the ranking for the 50 states and where Ohio ranks in terms of opioid addiction. There's plenty of work to be done. So when people say there isn't really, if you want to create a job guarantee, there are no jobs to be had, it's because they're thinking the for-profit world. So here's what the Green New Deal job guarantee component does. The job guarantee. It guarantees that anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work will find useful, productive work in their own community. So the philosophy here is you take people as they are, with whatever skills they have, where they are, so you don't tell them you have to move to San Francisco to find the jobs, and you do on-the-job training. Once we recognize the monetary sovereignty of the federal government, step number one, the federal government can do a lot of major infrastructure across the country. That's step number one. Step number two, state budgets and city budgets can be restored with grants from the federal government to serve the communities because only the federal government can afford those. But then you get to the micro details of small towns and small communities. And this is where a lot of the nonprofit organizations that have been doing all the social work over the last 3 decades, they're the ones who know what the needs are. They're the ones who are trying to meet those needs with whatever limited resources they have. They tend to be understaffed and underfunded. They're the ones who will be applying for the job guarantee grants from the federal government. And they say, we know what the needs are. This is the priority list. We know the people of the community, and this is the skills they have. And we're going to get the funding to do on-the-job paid training with benefits, including childcare benefits and healthcare benefits and all the things that matter for quality of life. And benefits, we have to completely rethink what benefits mean. Most people think a good salary, a good wage, and a good healthcare plan, that should be good, right? So we give you the job, and now you're set to go. But what if you've been struggling with addiction for the last 10 years? Giving me the job and the healthcare benefits is great, but it's not sufficient. You need the whole reparation of the social fabric of the community, the individuals, the family, the community, so that you actually allow people to thrive with that new job. So we have to rethink what repairing communities mean. It's not just a job with a decent wage. And these jobs are meant to be transition jobs, so people learn on-the-job skills and can transition into the private sector, they can transition into their own business, or if the job is meaningful enough and is important enough for the community, then that becomes a mainline job in the community. It's not a temporary thing. So this is really the kind of the 30,000-foot view of the job guarantee framework. Can we afford it? Or what do you think now? If I asked you this 30 minutes ago, yes, we can, right? Said somebody. Can we afford this? Can we afford the inequality? Can we afford the cancer treatment? So what I did about 10 years ago, I said, well, let's put some numbers on this and see how expensive this thing is going to be. So I said, let's say we pay skilled workers $21 an hour with benefits, semi-skilled workers $18 an hour, unskilled workers $15 an hour. Let's see, I want it to be as generous as possible just to see if this is really going to bankrupt the country. And you run the numbers and you say, assuming 23 million full-time workers, this is during the financial crisis, 23 million people, this was officially unemployed and all the hidden unemployment, people who were excluded from the statistics. 40 hours a week, benefits package, material cost to run the program. The net cost of this program is less than 4% of GDP. This is totally affordable from a standard, financial cost. And this is to eliminate unemployment and inequality altogether, or put a major dent, at least in this area, compared to what we did, trillions of dollars since 2008, and inequality is getting worse. Unemployment barely budged. It took 10 years for official unemployment to decline, but lots of hidden unemployment, lots of precarious work, and people working in the gig economy, trying to make, Uberizing the economy to make things happen. So the solutions are there. They're straightforward. You may not like them politically. That's fine. We can disagree on politics. But don't tell me the economics doesn't add up, right? So concluding remarks, and I'm happy to take questions. We have 12 years to go. The climate, inequality, poverty, injustice crisis call for urgent and bold action, not small, not experimental, not let's see how it goes, not let's rely on these incentives, maybe it will, fix itself. The current climate and jobs policies are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. I mean, if they work, we'll say that's fine, they at least did the job, but they don't even work. So economic justice and climate justice via a living wage Green New Deal are possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you. And I think we have time for questions. I have time for questions. I don't know about you, so I'm here. I'll answer questions. Absolutely not. Yes, please. Start. Right. 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 And that's why we talk about restoring and repairing the damage that's been done. In order for that care economy to be effective, we have to work at it. It's not going to happen automatically. So the good news is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be gradual transition. There's plenty of all kinds of work that needs to be done, including care today. And we just have to go at it and start and build from within. And there's lots of resources in the private sector, lots of resources in the nonprofit sector. There's lots of nonprofit organizations who do that kind of work at a very small scale, minimal, impacts a handful of people, very meaningful for the handful of people who benefit from those things. We're saying, let's train more people and bring more funding to make that a profession that we value in society, not underpay, not dependent on generous donations from philanthropists. Let's make this the core of the economy, right? But we have to transition into it. It's not going to happen magically. Right? Yes, please.
So you talk about how great Japan is by giving out bonds and stuff to get rid of the debt and stuff. But countries like Venezuela and Soviet Union, why couldn't they issue bonds and get rid of the debt? And
good question. Right. So monetary sovereignty, which is what the US and Japan have, Venezuela doesn't have. Venezuela issues its own currency, taxes in its own currency, but it borrows in foreign currencies. So it has an external debt that's denominated in foreign currencies, and it fixes its exchange rate to other currencies. So once you start doing that, which most developing countries do, you start losing your monetary sovereignty. So if the debt that you owe, based on those government bonds, are denominated in your currency, then there's no financial constraint. You can always pay the principal and interest. But if you owe people money that you can't issue into existence, then you have to earn it, which means you have to export more, bring more tourism, bring more foreign direct investment, race to the bottom, compete with a bunch of other developing countries to bring more tourists, to bring more factories from the Western world, and that becomes a slippery slope for most developing countries. In addition to that, the productive capacity of the US is not the same as the productive capacity of Venezuela. I'm not going to go into the politics of, is it a coup, is it not a coup? the U.S. embargo plays a role in, limiting the productive capacity of the oil industry. It's a country that depends on one thing, which is oil, exports of oil. And if you don't have the valves, if you don't have the pumps to pump oil, and you can't have the spare parts, then you're not producing anything, you're not selling anything, you're broke, right? So completely different scenario of what the U.S. potential is, Japan's potential is, Canada's potential is, versus developing countries that don't have the resources and face all kinds of corruption, limitations and resource limitations. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part. We should have more. Oh, no, not at all. Nobody said the government should run businesses. Where did I say this today? The government is going to complement what the private sector is not doing. So the system we have today, we have the private sector doing its own thing, looking for profits and hiring people based on rates of return. They're not going to hire people as a charity just to make people employed, right? So we're not going to change that. Then we have the government sector doing its own thing, but doing it in a limited way. And then we have the nonprofit sector doing whatever it can with some grants from state and federal and other nonprofits. We're saying the government will introduce a job guarantee program, not guaranteeing jobs in the private sector, guaranteeing jobs in the community service area, which is driven mostly by nonprofits and local government. So what happens when somebody's unemployed for 2 years? They become unemployable. And this is what we have. Long-term unemployment, you become unemployable. This is what the private sector will label you, which means if, as a private sector, if I have the choice between hiring somebody who's working for a competitor, choice number one, versus somebody who's been unemployed for 6 months or 2 years, who am I going to hire? I want somebody who's ready to go on day one. So the job guarantee will take the unemployed population and do on-the-job training so that after a few months, you become more employable to transition in the private sector if you want to transition. But the thing is that during that time period, you're building skills, you're building your resume, you have a track record of showing up every day, you're learning new skills, and you will have a recommendation letter from your supervisor, which if you're unemployed for 2 years, you have none of that, you don't even make it through the interview process. So the capitalist system that we live in, we're not going to change it. We're going to take one component and adjust it so that we allow people to transition into opportunities, as opposed to say, you're unemployed, you need new skills, go get the skills on your own, pay for those with student debt, get the certification. By the time you get the certification, there's no guarantee that you'll find a job in the private sector. By that time, the new certifications that you just earned are obsolete, maybe. So it's a trap. It's unfair, it's cruel to allow people to get stuck in that situation systematically, not by choice, right? So most of the focus that we have about unemployment today and the unemployed, the people we label unemployed and unemployable, is a cruel system that's unfair. Imagine the following situation. Imagine you have, is Easter coming up soon? So you have an Easter egg hunt. And we hide 95 eggs in the park, and we set out the kids. We have 100 kids and say, go find eggs. 100 kids, 95 eggs. 5 kids are going to come back at the end of the day, and they'll be crying. They'll say, I didn't find anything. Well, we set them up to fail. So what do we do in the economy? We take those 5 kids, and we tell them, you have a problem. You need new skills. We're going to put you through a boot camp to train you how to find eggs in the next cycle. And we train them really hard, and we put a lot of resources and repeat the same exercise. We put 100 kids and 95 eggs. Those 5 kids are going to come back with 2 or 3 eggs because they're really good at it now. But somebody else will be unemployed. This is the thing. What we have is a limited number of job offerings, not a limited number of, so do you see what I mean? So the job guarantee program focuses on the so-called unemployable population that keeps getting stuck in that vicious cycle. And the unemployable is a code word for women, minorities, people with disabilities, people with lower levels of education and skills, returning citizens who spend time incarcerated. That becomes the stigma of that quote-unquote unemployable group, undesirable group. And that's just not fair for the system and not productive for society as a whole, because the more unemployment we have, this is true for every country, including in this country, the larger the level of unemployment, the higher the levels of stress for families, physical stress and mental stress, depression, suicide, divorce, domestic violence, child abuse, crime. All of these things already cost us so much money as a society, as individuals, as communities, and so much pain as a society. And it's unnecessary, but it's part of how the system is currently designed. So we want the job guarantee to address the root causes and allow people to transition into productive employment with decent wages and benefits, not keep putting the blame on individuals and say, you made a mistake when you were 16, too bad, you're gonna spend the rest of your life like this. Or you made a mistake by leaving the labor force because you had to take care of an elderly parent, and now 5 years later you're coming back with no experience, no resume, too bad, you can't, we're gonna punish you for the rest of your life. Or you're gonna be stuck in a low-paying job for the rest of your life. Even people with college degrees and experience and all that, you leave the market for 5 years, you can't come back, right? That's the current system, unless you have some level of privilege and access, but it's not automatic. It's not a right for every human being to participate. So happy to talk more about Venezuela versus the US. There's a whole other subject. Other questions, or I don't know, I'm not watching the time. I'm here until midnight, so if anybody wants to stay. Oh, we're done. Okay, but I'm here until midnight, so if you want to, thank you.
So what did you think? Please leave comments below. Let us know what you thought. Let us know, how you came to understand MMT. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll be very happy to answer. Of course, if you want to reach out to Professor Kaboub, he will also be very happy to answer. One thing I want to bring to light, one thing I want to make very clear, thing that really stood out to me with this particular video, was that we need to stop celebrating GDP, gross domestic product, the accumulation of all sales of goods and services in the United States. We always celebrate the growth of GDP. We call that the growth of the economy. But what we really should be focusing on is GPI, Genuine Prosperity Indicator. As Dr. Kaboub pointed out, GDP goes up, but the Genuine Prosperity Indicator flatlines. The difference between how much we're spending versus how much our lives are improving. There's all kinds of spending out there that we celebrate but do not contribute to our quality of life. We need to start having the conversation about these fundamental differences. The money that we are spending, the money that you spend, I spend, and the federal government spends. Where is that money going to? Who is benefiting from that spending? And is it improving the quality of our lives? There can't possibly be a more important conversation when it comes to the quality of federal spending. So I hope this video kickstarted some things in your brain. I hope it starts kickstarting conversations amongst you and your family and your friends. Have conversations at work. Have these conversations. We have to start somewhere, and we have to start now. We'll be back next week.